If the current federal political circumstances seem familiar, well, maybe it's because we have been here before. Of our last 7 elections, 5 have resulted in so-called hung parliaments. But history does suggest there are different paths forward that could make our apparent preference for minority parliament work and work well. Here to share their wisdom on that, we welcome, in Kingston, Ontario, Hugh Segal, who was Chief of Staff to both Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Premier Bill Davis. He's now ensconced at Queen's University. In London, Ontario, Kate Graham, Professor of Political Science at Western University and a former Ontario Liberal leadership candidate. And in the nation's capital, Tonda MacCharles, parliamentary reporter with the Toronto Star. And it's great to see you three again here on TVO. Want to go through a couple of graphics relatively quickly off the top here just to set the scene. For example, here's what Canadians decided in the Groundhog Day election we experienced the other day. Liberals at 158, Conservatives 119, the Bloc at 34, New Democrats 25, 2 Greens, and no People's Party. What does that mean going forward? Well, what it means is if you need 170 votes to get anything passed, the Liberals need to find a dance partner. That could mean 158 Liberals plus 25 New Democrats. That gets you to 183. That's enough. Or how about 158 Liberals and 34 Blocistes? That gets you to 192. That's enough. Or there's some things maybe the Liberals and the Conservatives will unite on, and that's 277 votes. And that would be enough. This is where we get Hugh Segal into our discussion here by saying, I want to take you back to 1977. Where we had almost the same circumstances as we had today. We had a premier who thought he was popular enough to call a snap election and get himself a majority government, and he found out, surprise, surprise, the public was not ready for that. They gave him a few more seats, but another minority. That was Bill Davis. You were there, Hugh Segal. How do you begin to consider options after a second consecutive minority government performance?
Well, the first thing you do is you interpret the direction from the voters as clear and precise, which is get back to work and stop the partisan creaming. And if you have a mirror on your desk, put it in a drawer and get busy with working with the other political parties. And that's what Mr. Davis said he would do on election night, in fact, in 77. And that's what he instructed cabinet and caucus to do, and those of us who were on his staff. So, for example, that resulted in a mechanical arrangement between the 3 parties called the Joint Legislative Planning Group, unheard of in the history of Ontario, where our legislative people and their legislative people met on a weekly basis to look at the coming week. Our motto was the old Holiday Inn motto, no surprises. We would let them know what we needed to do. They would let us know what they wanted to do. They would let us know what they weren't prepared to agree with. We accepted there were some things they had to stamp their flag on and disagree with, and we also looked for ways to work together. And that continued for the entire 4 years, where Mr. Davis took that minority and made it into a de facto 4-year majority government, number one. Number two, it's really important that for things that set the tone, throne speeches and budgets, you don't put it out and see how the opposition reacts. If you really want collaborative government, you actually sit down with the opposition parties beforehand and see what you think they need and what they want to tell you they need, so you can accommodate as much of that as possible in the program. That's how you do collaborative government. That's what the voters of Ontario wanted. That's what they got for 4 years, and that is why Mr. Davis, at the end of that 4-year period, was able to win a majority, because he had done what the voters had asked him to do during that 4-year period.
And let me do a quick follow-up. Do you think that which you just described was unique to that time and those people, or does it have application for today?
Some of it related to the relationship of respect that existed between existing party leaders, which have been built up over time. But I don't think there's anything particularly unique or particularly narrow about that approach. It can work. And to be fair to the present Prime Minister, and Tonda will know this and Kate will no doubt agree, no government has accepted more amendments from the opposition in majority and in minority and from the Senate, substantive amendments to legislation, than the present Trudeau administration. So there is some of that collaborative DNA there. And I think the opportunity now is to make it real.
All right, let's fast forward almost a decade, and we want to take a look at the 1985 Ontario election results, because those delivered a hung parliament as well. If you go back to 1985, you needed 63 seats for a majority government. Nobody got 63. The Progressive Conservatives had 52 under Frank Miller, Liberals 48 seats under David Peterson, which meant the NDP under Bob Rae held the balance of power. So the NDP had a decision to make. And to talk about that decision, we are delighted to welcome back to the airwaves at TVO, Dave Cooke, who was a member of the NDP government in Ontario from 1990 to 95, and of course a member of the Ontario legislature for many years before that as well. Dave, I would like you, if you would, to take us to the discussions that you as part of the NDP caucus would have had in 1985, holding the balance of power. How did you and your colleagues consider your options at that moment?
Well, we had several caucus meetings, that's for sure, and we looked at all of the options, everything from having a full-fledged be part of the government with whoever we negotiated with, to what we ended up with the actual agreement with the Conservatives. I would think, though, the dynamic during that time was so much different than it is today, in that there was pretty much a decision, even though we were negotiating with both parties, that the message coming out of the 85 election was the public, the province, was ready for a change in government. And so we did negotiate with both the Conservatives and the Liberals, but I think it was pretty much a consensus with caucus right at the beginning that if we got a deal with the Liberals that had enough of our stuff in it, that's the direction we had to go. It would have, of course, we would have lost our bargaining power if we had simply said, all we're going to do is negotiate with the Liberals. So we had to go and talk to both parties. I think the other thing that was important back then was we had really good staff too, like in the leader's office, who got along with staff in the other leaders' offices. And I think that kind of dialogue, aside from what Mr. Segal was just saying with the leaders, it's also important to have really mature staff who aren't going to play games, that simply want to find solutions. Because I don't know what your guest has said before me, but I think the message coming out of the election on Monday is you guys better go at least 3 and potentially 4 years. We don't want to see you again.
That was definitely a message that came out of Monday night. I think that's fair to say. Tell me this, though, Dave. I'll do a quick follow-up with you here. Minority parliaments often just go bill by bill, and they decide sort of as they go along what kind of program they want to pass. 1985 was very different. I mean, the staff you just talked about and the leaders, they sat down, they worked out a program, an accord of items. They were all listed what the items were. There were several dozen of them. Both leaders separately, but they both signed the agreement and agreed to have Parliament last at least 2 years to get all this stuff done. That was unique. Where did the notion of doing it that way come from?
I think that was Bob's idea.
Bob Rae?
Bob Rae's idea, because we did have the question of whether we should go to a full coalition. And there was a lot of people that just wouldn't go that direction. And quite frankly, in many of our caucus meetings, we had senior party people and Labor involved in our caucus meetings to help us to see where they thought we should go. And there was no appetite for a coalition, except for a few of us. So the idea came that we had to have a formal agreement. We couldn't go bill by bill, because that way there would be no guarantee that we would have 2 years of stability and 2 years of getting a lot of our agenda as part of government policy.
Okay. Kate Graham, come on in here and talk to me about this. I well remember, now this is 36 years ago, but there were voices at the time saying this is unconstitutional. And if it's not unconstitutional, it's highly irregular and highly suspicious. This accord that the Liberals and New Democrats signed 36 years ago. I mean, you know your constitutional history here. Is there anything illegal, unconstitutional, irregular, suspicious about any of that?
Well, I mean, as a 37-year-old, I'm probably not the best authority to speak to this, but we are coming up on, I believe, 50 minority governments in Canada, and if you include the Yukon and the provinces, and now 15 federally. And I think there are lots of different arrangements that can work. And to add to Dave's comment earlier in terms of the message of this election, I really think that Canadians they're focused on the challenges that we've all been through over the last few years. They want to see progress on things like climate change, housing, and childcare. And so regardless of what that arrangement looks like, I knocked on a lot of doors. I didn't hear anybody talking about this. What I did hear them talking about is wanting to see things like a universal, accessible, affordable childcare system in Canada. So regardless of what the coalition looks like, whether it's build a bill or something that's built to be a bit more enduring, I think what Canadians are looking for in the next few weeks is a return to what we saw a bit of at the beginning of the pandemic, where there was a real rise above of the partisanship and a focus on the things that we know matter most to people right now.
No, fair enough. But, we're all a bunch of political nerds here, so we're going to get a little deep in the weeds, which is not a terrible thing. But I guess I'm curious, you deal with university students, smart, young, up-and-coming people every day of your professional life. Do they have an understanding, in your view, about what's sort of permitted and what's not when we have these hung parliaments and how it all works?
I mean, I do teach political science classes. We talk a lot about the mechanics of how this can work. But I'm teaching a course right now, actually, incidentally, where we had students volunteering on campaigns in several ridings of 4 different political parties. And again, the thing that they're interested in is they observed firsthand how divisive our partisanship can be. We saw some really unfortunate moments during this campaign. I'm from London. I was at the event where, gravel was literally thrown at the Prime Minister. Those are the things that I'm hearing that students are concerned about right now, is in a moment where we're going through, multiple crises and where our politics can be built to divide us, is what are the avenues to be able to overcome that? And I think there are examples in Canadian history, but there's also examples all around the world. New Zealand has had minority governments for the better part of the last 30 years. They've taken different paths, but I think we need to look at what are the big things we need to accomplish right now and what are the best ways to do that. And that's what I'm hearing that students are interested in right now.
Gotcha. All right. To that end, we'll pass the microphone to Tonda MacCharles, because you know the players today. Do you have any sense about whether the Liberals and their potential dance partners, as we outlined on that chart earlier, are yet having discussions about how this next minority parliament could work?
Not yet. They definitely are not yet having those discussions because, first of all, the mail-in ballots haven't been counted. There could be a shift, although I think there's some 17 ridings where, people are saying that things are still in play. But legitimately, for the Liberals' sake, I think there's about 2 to 3 seats that could go either way, and that could bring them up to 160, or it could drop them down from 158, right, to 156. So they're not having those discussions yet. And I talked to New Democrat strategists on election night, and I remember this from during the pandemic, the way the government negotiated or didn't negotiate with the other sides. Oftentimes they did come with a ready-made proposal. Here's what we want to do, and there wasn't a lot of input in advance. And we saw that, for example, in the emergency benefits for individuals, the CERB. It was the pressure of not just the NDP and the Conservatives, but also Liberal caucus members that eventually raised that up from 10% to 75% for people. So look, the NDP say those kinds of discussions, they don't expect to get underway until they get closer, the government gets closer to forming its cabinet and developing a throne speech, which suggested to me that they didn't expect to have a formal arrangement wherein they might have cabinet seats, right? And the Liberals, to be honest, I think they're still doing a very deep dive on the results and trying to figure out, what exactly happened in different ridings. But there's no question, if we look at the overall picture, that 60% of Canadians, if you combine all the progressive votes, the Liberal, the NDP, the Greens, voted for a program that the Liberals put forward, largely more aggressive action on climate change, the $10 a day daycare. And I think where they might find support from the Conservatives, but the Conservatives are in no mood to start cooperating with the Liberals right now because O'Toole's trying to save his leadership. But where they could find some common ground on that would be like on the affordability pocketbook issues, the housing measures and some of that stuff. Look, all parties said they would, I think the phrase was build, preserve, or repair 1 million houses or 1 million plus. So there are going to be areas of common ground. I think for the Prime Minister, what argues for moving quickly and getting big things done is because whether or not he stays around or wants to stay around past a minority mandate into another either bid for a majority or what comes beyond, he's going to want to get things done, big things done, either for himself and his next arguments, his next prosecution of another election, or for whoever comes behind him. What mitigates against all that, I believe, is that I don't think that many of the other parties are in the mood to help him, although they do have to recognize they spent 5 weeks knocking on doors and hearing those messages. So they know that Canadians want them to get along. I think the push me, pull you thing for Erin O'Toole is he's under tremendous pressure right now and challenge. And so, I honestly, we're going to see a lot happen in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and that will set the tone for the next Parliament. The election night speeches, frankly, I didn't find them all that conciliatory or, cooperative. I mean, frankly, a lot of them hit all their election campaign talking points. So,
All right. In which case, that takes me to Hugh Segal again to say, Tonda has just told us that the phone calls have not yet started between the parties dealing with the new reality that they face. Drawing on your own experience, how's that going to work? Who picks up the phone first? Who do they call? How does it work?
Well, I think it's the Prime Minister who has to take the first step. And quite aside from the telephone calls and all of that, there are things the Prime Minister could do and signal now which would not offend his base, but would respond to a strong public and parliamentary desire. For example, the other parties offered during the days of the pandemic for there to be a joint parliamentary oversight group looking at all the pandemic issues so they could be approached as appropriately in a nonpartisan way. I'm not suggesting the government was excessively partisan, but if the Prime Minister were now to propose, and there's always a meeting of the last cabinet, of which there'll be some members showing up for the last time, before the new cabinet, they could approve that proposal where all the parties would work together and establish a 10-person committee of all the political parties looking at the pandemic and the future dynamics together. That would be a very, very positive signal to the other parties and to the country that he's serious about working together. And if, as Tonda perhaps worries, one of the other parties may say we don't want to help, that will reflect badly on them. But I don't think that would be the response.
And Dave Cooke, do you sense any appetite in the current cast of characters for something as intriguing as the Accord that you guys passed in 1985? Or does this look more like a kind of a bill-by-bill minority parliament?
Well, I'm hoping that the NDP caucus, because they would be the natural party to have some kind of an agreement with, I'm hoping that they won't take that off the table, that they'll actually talk about it in caucus. I think there's much overlap with the two platforms. The other thing, I think I totally agree with Hugh. It would be a terrific message if right away they'd get off the table and start working together, whether it's a committee or the leaders, but doing something to the pandemic. Because while I agree there are other priorities for this Parliament, right now a lot of people, most people in this country, just want to see the pandemic dealt with and getting behind us. So I think that's really important. The other thing is I read in the paper today some of Mr. Singh's musings about what he wants to see done. And I would just very much caution leaders to start putting out on the table now what their demands are, because I think it needs to be looked at together. The caucus needs to come in and talk about it and see how they can work together. But to start putting out more demands is just not going to work.
Well, that's it. I mean, Kate, Hugh Segal started this by saying you need to have a premier or a prime minister who is prepared to kind of share power more than has traditionally been the case. Do you see in the current Liberal administration a willingness to kind of open up more, share power more in order to make sure the minority parliament works?
I'm feeling very hopeful right now. I mean, again, we started this discussion by talking about Canadian history, and there are lots of examples where major policy innovations have come from minority governments and have come from moments where we do see leaders extending the hand and saying we want to work together. I heard from Justin Trudeau on this campaign repeatedly about the issues that I do believe are central to this moment. And I already mentioned climate change, childcare, housing, finishing the fight against COVID-19. I hope that all of the leaders across parties take the message away from this race that Canadians want to see dramatic action. We talk so much about build back better and a new normal, and we have this, I think, unusual moment right now to be able to make some major gains on things that, like childcare that we've been talking about for decades. It is long past time. It is time to get that done, and that's what I hope we see the focus on right now.
I was just going to say that's no longer really even a fight, right? Like the deals are signed with 7 provinces, 1 territory. Alberta has signaled to the government they are interested in at least talking about how that might look. Ontario as well. So the childcare piece, I think, as a result of the vote, is going to move forward, right? It's on autopilot now. It is going to happen. Whether or not Ontario or Alberta are ready to leave billions on the table and not do childcare, I doubt that. But in terms of, getting things done, I got to say, guys, I feel you all sound so optimistic, but having come off not just that campaign and the last parliament and looking ahead at the challenges facing both the leaders and getting out of the pandemic, I actually see I have a bit of a less optimistic view, a pessimistic view. They'll surprise me if they actually pull this off and work together.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Tonda. Presumably, much of this is helped if the Prime Minister and his most likely dance partner, in this case, I guess NDP leader Jugmeet Singh, have a decent personal relationship. Do we know if they do?
They don't. Look, Jugmeet Singh just spent 5 weeks prosecuting the case that Justin Trudeau, you couldn't trust him as far as you can throw him. They don't have a good relationship. Since last spring, Jugmeet Singh has been saying that the Liberals never do what they say they're going to do. They haven't had that kind of relationship even through pandemic. I mean, they might sort of respect each other's political skills, and I think they do. But personally, Justin Trudeau told the Star's editorial board that the way Jugmeet Singh has conducted himself in this election has contributed to the cynicism. He's terribly angry that the NDPs went out and campaigned across the country telling everybody that he'd done nothing. And he was very animated when he said, it's not nothing. We've done childcare. We have a real plan on climate change. It's not nothing. And he was actually quite angry about what he called the NDP's misleading on the record and contributing to that public cynicism writ large. So guys, no, there's not a great personal relationship. There's no bromance. They both love social media. They both have an Instagram game, but this is not, going to be a waltz. If anything, this is going to be like a, what do you call it? Slam down, breakdown dance or something.
You're real hep with the new terms there. Go ahead, Kate.
So Hugh started this by saying it's time to put the mirror on the desk in the drawer. And I actually kind of hope we see the opposite happen. Campaigning is not governing. We all know that. There will need to be a shift now. The parties, no longer, in my view, have the same incentive around discrediting one another. They know and they've heard the message that there are a very short list of issues that matter a lot. And so, that may have been the dynamic during the campaign, but I cannot help but retain my optimism that we may see a change in the weeks to come.
Well, Hugh Segal, let me follow up with you on that, because one of the reasons that they said that 45 years ago the minority parliaments in Ontario lasted for 6 years and worked as well as they did is that Bill Davis and the then NDP leader Stephen Lewis really got on very well and eventually developed a lifelong friendship. How significant is it in your view that the players actually like each other to make this work?
Well, let's remember that when the majority Conservative government was reduced to a minority in 75, in large measure because Mr. Lewis campaigned so effectively and said some very, very tough things about the Davis government, that did not spawn the relationship of working together in mutual respect. That developed afterwards. When Mr. Lewis was leader of the opposition, Mr. Davis was a minority premier. The Liberals had been reduced to third place, which is always happy for New Democrats and Conservatives. And on that basis, the relationship was built. So I would not, I don't disagree with Tonda's analysis at all, but I wouldn't presume that the nature of the dynamic going forward will be always limited by what it's been up until election day. Because all of these leaders have seen the message, they've heard it. If they have competent pollsters, it'll be explained to them. Then the issue is, what do you do now? And you can't make progress through sustained tactical animosity. It doesn't get you anywhere, and that's the choice they have to make. Dave
Cooke, you want in on that?
Could I just pop in there for a sec? Let's also remember in 1977, Stephen resigned as leader. And so for the largest part of minority government, Michael Cassidy was the leader of the NDP. And if I remember correctly, I don't think that Michael Cassidy and Bill Davis were best of friends. The reality in that 4 years was the NDP had a new leader. And I would say, as a member of that caucus, we were not overly optimistic of how well that leader was going to be leading us and take us into the next election. So we did not want an election. The Liberals didn't want an election. So the dynamic really was, we got to do everything we can to work as well as we can with the government and avoid an election. So it was quite a different dynamic than, say, when Stephen and Mr. Davis were there together.
Okay, but Hugh, let me circle back with you on one thing. And you mentioned that in 1977, after winning the second consecutive minority government, Mr. Davis basically said, okay, no more monkey business, no more snap elections. We're going to serve the full term unless I'm, voted down in a motion of non-confidence by the opposition. But I have no plans to call any snap elections, and he didn't. My question for you is, should Justin Trudeau make the same commitment to Canadians that Mr. Davis made 46 years ago?
So the benefit of doing that, and I would say to the Prime Minister, as Mr. Davis concluded, was if you say that and you make that part of how you intend to govern, that means that if there is a fracture that is produced by the opposition, they're going to pay the price for it. So you create a negative incentive for the opposition to stir things up in a way that produces a destroyed parliament, and you therefore absolve yourself in a way that's constructive. So I think when you take the high ground that way and you're frank with voters, but what your intention is, that is in and of itself a stabilizing effect.
Kate, I don't know that the Prime Minister calls you for advice, but if he does, sorry, Tonda, go ahead. You wanted to add?
Stephen Harper brought in a law that said fixed elections. That was his intention. You can state your intention, but and then he proceeded to call an early election. So it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Sometimes, yes. But having said that, Kate Graham, do you think Justin Trudeau should make a commitment to Canadians? No more snap elections. We're going to serve the full 4-year term.
I'm really worried about, and some of this tone was a bit much for me in this campaign about criticizing the fact that we're having an election, because the underlying assumption is that elections are things to be avoided, that we should just allow power to continue on without checking in with the public. August is normally kind of a sleepy time, and this year, instead, there were literally hundreds of thousands of people standing on doorsteps and on Zoom meetings and having phone calls and talking about the direction that we want to go as a country. So, what's the right tactical advice? Smarter people than I can sort that out, but I think we need to be really careful about talking about elections like they're things that are a waste of money or things that we should avoid. They are the reason that we as Canadians get to have a say in the direction that we go. And, I for one, am hoping that we have some time where we stop talking about it like it's a big waste of effort and money. I don't see it that way at all.
No, fair enough. But Tonda is also right that we do have something called the fixed election date law, which everybody, pays homage to and then proceeds to ignore. Do you think maybe we ought to do things a little differently on that regard?
Well, dynamics are different, obviously, depending on the moment in time. I do think the predictability is nice. One of the things that was problematic in this election, and again, speaking from a campus perspective, is, we didn't have the time to have voting stations on university campuses, for example. Lots of people had some difficulty in voting. So a fixed time allows us, I think, to plan for elections and make sure that everybody has the easiest opportunity to vote. So there are some benefits there. But again, I know that there are moments in time where an election makes sense, and I do think that as Canadians, we should value more the opportunity for us to have a say in those moments in time.
Dave Cooke, down to my last
third. Some time. We got a provincial election coming up next year. We got a municipal election. I think there's a couple of other provincial elections. So there'll be lots of opportunity, but I still think the dramatic message coming out of Monday was, you guys gotta, I shouldn't use the term guys, but the MPs have got to work together and put together the agenda and deliver.
And that is our time on this episode of The Agenda. Speaking of which, Hugh Segal, Dave Cooke, Kate Graham, Tonda MacCharles, really good having all four of you on TVO tonight. Until next time.
Thanks, Steve. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.